Welcome back to Detailed, an original podcast by RCAT. This is the show where we uncover lessons learned to help you navigate your next project. I'm Cherise Lakeside, Senior Spec Writer at RDH Building Science, and your host. My guest today is Cory Hawbecker, Principal and Sustainability Director at Holst Architecture with offices in Portland, Oregon, and Minneapolis, Minnesota. As an architect and Holst's Sustainability Director, Cory is an advocate for sustainable practices in the built environment. His extensive knowledge of high-performance design strategies, alternative energy technologies, material sourcing, and methods to optimize energy performance is invaluable to their clients and design teams. Cory excels at working with clients, builders, and consultants to find and implement the best possible solutions to challenging technical and design problems. Cory's experience spans a variety of project types, scales, and contexts that range from affordable housing developments and private residences to award-winning libraries and commercial projects. The project we will be talking about today is the Jigme Singye Wangchuck School of Law Library in Pangbisa, Paro, Bhutan. The Jigme Singye Wangchuck School of Law Library marks a profound milestone for Bhutan. The creation of the nation's first law school, envisioned as a place where future leaders will study and shape the country's evolving legal framework. Holst worked closely with a diverse team of Bhutanese engineers and craftspeople to realize this vision, balancing high performance and sustainable design with centuries-old Bhutanese traditions. Now, let's get into the details. Welcome back to Detailed. My guest today is Cory Hawbecker, Principal and Sustainability Director at Holst Architects with offices right here where I live in Portland, Oregon, and also in Minneapolis, Minnesota. The project we are talking about today is the Jigme Singye Wangchuck School of Law Library in Pangbisa, Paro, Bhutan, nestled in the eastern Himalayas. I have to admit, Cory, this is the first time I've done an interview on a project in the Himalayas. Welcome, Cory. Welcome to Detailed. How are you today?
I'm doing really well. How are you?
I am good. I don't know about you, but I'm glad it's Friday and almost a 3-day weekend.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
We'll still be doing some work this weekend. I think that's a necessary evil in this business that we work in, that I don't think there's ever any such thing as a vacation or a 3-day weekend that doesn't have some piece of work involved in it.
I tend to use holidays as catch-up days.
Yep. Yeah, me too. See, we're all a bunch of workaholics. So I like to start with an icebreaker question with all my guests, just to get us warmed up a little bit and to find out something about you. And so for you today, and I try to pick something different every time, for you today, the beauty of this project inspired my question. So I would like to know, what is the most beautiful place you have ever visited, and what was it that moved you to feel that way?
Well, Portland in the Pacific Northwest is quite beautiful. I grew up in the Midwest where it's flat and kind of dull. But I'd say 10 years ago, I had the opportunity to go to Iceland, and I would say that is the most beautiful place I've been. I've been to the Himalayas, I've been to New Zealand, all over the United States, but Iceland is really kind of a singular place. I think it's very alien, desolate, beautiful, just really a unique place. And I think of it often.
Yeah, that's funny because I've never been to Iceland, and hasn't been on my top 10 list of places because there's so many places I want to go.
Right.
But you are probably like the 5th person that I know that has been to Iceland and can't say enough about it when they get back.
It's amazing.
How incredible it is. So it's kind of inching up my list. Like maybe this needs to happen sooner rather than later. Let's talk about this project. Okay, so seriously, I could probably do about 5 interviews with you on this project. I'm reading through it and I'm like, oh, he's never going to get out of here. He's going to have to talk to me for days. I have so many questions that I struggled a little bit on where to start and, how can I get all the good stuff I want to get? So my first one is, and I'm dying to know this. I want to know how the heck a firm in Portland, Oregon, where I live here, ended up working on a project in Bhutan. I'm dying to know how you landed this project.
Yeah, it's kind of a long story, and it goes back to actually, I started at Holst in 2005, and probably the first project I worked on was private residence for a gentleman in the area. And he's very passionate about sustainability and climate change. That project ended up not happening, but he came back a few years later and wanted another design for private residence. And this time he wanted it to be Pass House certified. He wanted it to be Minergie P Eco certified, which is like a European sustainability certification, which is sort of kind of a, if you bolted together Passive House with LEED, it's a bit like that, and then a LEED certification. So we got 3 certifications on that house. It was constructed. It's called the Karuna House. Really turned out well. He was pleased with it. It did hit all the certification goals. And from there, we worked on another project for him, which was a office development here in Portland called One North. That was not certified, but it was built to kind of pass out strategies and high performance building strategies. And while that was under construction, um, he came to our office one day with a DWG file, which was a survey of some mountainside in Bhutan. And he's like, "Hey, is your passport current?" And I don't think it was at the time, but it turns out he had been in correspondence with the Bhutan Foundation, which is a non-governmental organization that helps kind of should work with non-governmental organizations and charities outside of Bhutan to funnel money into Bhutan to serve certain needs. He has this individual has a organization called the Karuna Foundation, which is really focused on climate change, mitigating the effects of climate change, understanding what that means for the country of Bhutan, Bhutan in particular, because they're especially vulnerable to the effects of climate change. It's a rather agrarian economy overall. But one of their chief exports is actually hydroelectric power to India. They have, very mountainous country, and so they're using these run of the river style hydroelectric plants to generate electricity. They sell it to India. Um, and if climate change impacts their, precipitation, snowpack, and that sort of thing, it's going to affect their not only their exports to India, which is a chief, financial driver of how the economy works there, but also all the agrarian farmers there. They're going to be impacted very greatly by changes to their climate. And so his foundation is sort of working in a very variety of ways in Bhutan to help understand and mitigate those effects for people there. And at an event, he met Princess of Bhutan, and one of the princesses of Bhutan, who is a trained lawyer, was educated at Stanford University, and she is developing, or at the time, she was developing the Royal Institute of Law. Bhutan at that time didn't have a law school. All their lawyers were trained in India or Australia, and then they came back trained in Indian or Australian law, and then came back to Bhutan and kind of had to like learn Bhutanese law and learn how to practice there. So they needed a law school in country. So she was developing that at that time. He had just gone through this process of developing his house and this office building to high performance design standards, and was really passionate about that and passionate about the benefits of that style of construction beyond just like the energy savings, but like comfort and those sorts of things that you get with passive house style or high performance design style construction. And so he was talking to her and like, hey, if you're going to be building this campus, that's where the future leaders of Bhutan are going to be trained. Eventually those lawyers will probably get into elective office, get into the government. And if we can kind of convince them and have them suffused in this environment where it's like comfortable and a pleasant place to be, and they know about the energy savings, and they know about all the kind of benefits of this high performance design strategy. Eventually that will kind of like work its way up into the government and work its way up through society and become more normalized as a style of construction in Bhutan. Because currently they are modernizing rapidly, but they're trying to preserve kind of the architectural heritage that they have. They have a very distinct style of construction aesthetically, and it's very challenging to kind of meld those two together. And so, as he's talking to the princess and as she's getting more and more excited, he brings in me and Holst Architecture because we had been working closely together on these things to advise their architects who are developing the law school designs on how to build them in a high performance way. So really that was in 2015. And so the first 2 years of the project really were just me and a few other individuals who are kind of in the past house world, um, working with the group of architects and builders in Bhutan to adapt their design and like I said, kind of weld high performance design strategies with this Bhutanese design aesthetic. That Bhutanese design aesthetic is very masonry driven. There's a lot of timber in it, but the kind of the base component of the buildings are all these massive battered walls. So they're, a meter thick at the ground and they kind of taper up as they go up. They're traditionally made out of stone or rammed earth. So really massive uninsulated walls are sort of the fundamental enclosure that they use. And then in those, there are kind of timber protrusions, again, uninsulated, oftentimes single pane glazing. Um, and so as they're modernizing their styles of construction, they're importing reinforced concrete construction and infilling that with masonry. None of it's insulated typically. Again, still sticking with single pane glazed windows, very leaky construction. All of the uh, mechanical heating and cooling is really done well, mostly heating because in the most of the country it's very mountainous, and so the climate is cool to cold. There's sort of a periphery at the very southern end of the country that's quite hot. It's essentially India's climate, but where we're at for this project is similar to, I would say, to Oregon, like a really mild climate most of the year. So more heating dominated. So they're really using electric resistance heat because electricity is so cheap. They're generating tons of it. They use a lot of electric resistance heat and no ventilation really. So the buildings are leaky. They're kind of uncomfortable. They're very massive, so they hold on to the cold a long time. So he's trying to convince, or we're trying to work with the architects there to insulate and air seal these buildings while preserving the architectural heritage. And so that's how I got involved initially. This is becoming a long answer. Sorry.
No.
It's kind of a long story. So anyway, that was 2015 to 2017. We were advising their architects. And the campus design that they came up with really didn't have a place for a library. And in law schools, the law library is kind of a central component of that. And so at that time, I think their architects were kind of overwhelmed with the scope and scale of things. And so we were brought in as a design architect for the library, which is sort of a freestanding part of the campus.
Truly a once in a lifetime opportunity.
Mhm.
I mean, I've been working in this business for a really long time, and I have never gone anywhere near a project like that. And for some big firms, so that's amazing. As you mentioned, there's a princess in this story. Who doesn't love a story with a princess? Give me a little background on the client and You kind of described the drive already behind making this project a reality. So give me a little background on the client and what's it like to work with royalty?
Well, strange, I would say. They're very insulated, I think, from the day to day work. And so I only met with her 2 or 3 times, and it was very much, um, uh, controlled, and what what we talked about was very, sort of limited, because her time is limited, and, essentially, she's sort of, like, followed around by minders quite a lot. She's very kind and very supportive of the project, but most of the interaction that we had was sort of indirect through, her people. So if there was something that she saw in the design process that she didn't like, we sort of heard about it second or third hand, which is actually one of the challenges of the project is who, like, I was working technically for the Karuna Foundation. The Karuna Foundation is supporting this project, but the princess kind of has ultimate say on a lot of the decisions, and so everything that we're doing, and as you know, and as your listeners might know who work in the profession, that direct conversation with clients is really important, and how, like, the ability to be responsive and to kind of get a sense, even through like nonverbal communication about how they feel about certain things, is really helpful. I had none of that, so it was very a lot of guesswork sometimes as to like, well, what do I think that they meant by that? And so it did, I think, put some sand in the gears of the design process. And when we're trying to do something out of the ordinary, making the case for that was sort of challenging because it's got to go through those layers of people. So I guess that's kind of the background on it. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I'm curious. I'm already going down a rabbit hole question, but I have to ask this question. So when, for instance, if you met the Queen of England, you're required to curtsy. There's some traditional norms that you're supposed to observe.
Mhm.
Before you met the princess for the first time, were you coached on anything in particular you were expected to do?
No, no, they're really, I think, down to earth people. They're just very insulated because when they interacted with me and the other Americans involved in the project, I think they were just trying to be as, I guess, down to earth as possible. The Bhutanese revere them, and so all the Bhutanese in the room sort of behaved um, in a subdued fashion, and so I think naturally you just sort of start to mimic that, and so it was just really interesting the couple of times I met her, and I met her mother as well, Queen Bhutan. All very interesting interactions. Like I said, very kind, very supportive of the project, but just it's just sort of interesting how everybody in the room sort of revolves around the reactions and what that person, like the central person in the room, is doing.
There's an article or a blog, or I don't know what you call it, on your website, because I did a little homework outside of what you sent me, that somebody in your office wrote about visiting over there. And and you should put that person's name on the article. That person's name is not
Oh,
on the article anywhere,
that's strange.
because
Well,
I was like, because it looks like there's a couple people probably from your office in the picture. But it was just fascinating. One of the things I mentioned in the article or in the blog was being gifted a hot stone bath on the construction site, and I'm like,
mhm.
I'm not even gonna ask what that is, but I can't even, this is not something you go on a construction site in the United States and have
Yeah.
happen.
Well, I could tell you the person. Her name is Yuki Bowman. She was involved in the project. I should also name some other people. Sil Roberson, who was helped with the design process. Yuki was instrumental in the design process. Yuki, like myself, was lucky enough to get to go visit the site. We didn't go together. We kind of went independently. And the hot stone bath. So because the site is rather remote, sort of on a mountainside outside of Paro, which is where their central international airport is, but it's really a small town. So it feels very rural. Because of that, and there's not really a housing around there, people who are building the building essentially live on the construction site. So they've got sort of shacks set up where they live. And so they do everything there, including the hot stone baths. So a hot stone bath is essentially a tub of water and you heat rocks in a fire and then drop the rocks into the water. And there's a barrier there, a little partition, so you don't accidentally touch the hot rocks. But yeah, it heats the water very effectively.
It'll be interesting to see after this interview airs how many construction sites are asking for hot stone baths in the United States. I loved reading that blog. Um, so I'm curious. Obviously, this project is across the world. What did the planning and programming process look like for this project? And I mean, I imagine I meant to look it up before this interview and I forgot. I don't know what the time difference is. I imagine that had to be pretty challenging because you didn't have people there full time, correct?
Now, well, I'll take that back. We did have a technical advisor on site during construction, pretty much the duration of construction. But, the time zone difference is 12 or 13 hours depending on our time change. They don't do daylight savings time. So essentially we're completely offset in terms of the hours of the day. Um, it was challenging to have verbal conversations. We'd have to have those early in the morning or late at night on both ends. Their internet wasn't always the best, and so video calls weren't really possible. It's pretty much audio only. In terms of the design process and how that worked, it was a lot of um, sort of we've done library work before. We kind of know how they work. We had done some site visits around the United States in terms of law libraries, particularly in the Pacific Northwest, and saw how those operated. We brought some Bhutanese over here to kind of see that, and they also had a couple of library administrators on their end who understood like their collection and the kinds of things they were working with, looking for. So effectively, we kind of took all that information and proposed design ideas, and emailed them and had conversations as needed about the progress and size and scale and scope and configuration and that sort of thing. So it was not unlike a normal design process. It was just there was a lot of lag in terms of how quickly you get feedback.
I'm curious if we talked about time zones, was language a barrier? I remember working on a project once where we got all the drawings. Project I forgot.
No,
Forgot what country it was in. It was in the Middle East, I believe.
skip
But we got all the
that in
drawings, and there
lyrics.
was nothing in English.
Oh.
Um, so that got real entertaining. And I'm a spec writer, so words are my,
Yeah, yeah.
I need words, and I'm like, I have no idea what I'm looking at here. Was there language barriers, or do the Bhutanese speak English?
So most of the people that we dealt with spoke English. Like I said, they had been predominantly trained architects to train in India or Australia oftentimes, so their English is quite good. Some of the people actually doing the work didn't speak English, but essentially, the people I dealt with day to day were intermediaries when there was a conversation that needed to be had. So that wasn't really a challenge. I think maybe the trickiest communication challenge that we had was more cultural. I think the Bhutanese are a very polite people. They're very deferential. They sign off all their emails with like "la." They add "la" as a kind of, I don't know, to kind of emphasize how much respect that they have when they're writing to you. I think the challenge is that they have a hard time being direct and saying no. Like, I can't do that. I don't understand what you're saying. And so sometimes, they're essentially kind of nodding their head yes, and you don't know, but they don't understand what you're trying to tell them. And that was kind of a challenge, is figuring out when they were being polite, and trying to suss out. do they really want to do this? Can they really do this? Do they understand what I'm trying to tell them, or do I need to be more clear? And so after 8 years of working on the project, I kind of got that got that figured out, but it took a long time.
So I'm curious, obviously, we do a lot of crazy things in the United States with our buildings. How prepared was the design and construction community in Bhutan to take on this project? Because you're basically asking them to take what they know
Mhm,
and do something that's pretty different.
mhm.
Um, did that pose challenges?
Um, I think so. They were up for the challenge, and I think they really strongly believed in what we were trying to do. I think the biggest challenge, well, there's a couple of challenges. One is the way that they do documentation is different there. There are no specifications. Um,
Ah,
I know, right?
that hurts.
Um, when I started in my career, I was like, "What do I need this 1,000-page document for?" But I've I've
Hopefully,
learned,
you know now why you need it.
yeah, there's a lot of value there to kind of fill in the question marks about, like, what does the drawing mean, really? So they don't really do that. They don't have contracts the way that we understand them. And so the translation between what my intent is, what I put on the page, and what actually gets built is kind of challenging to be sure, especially since I'm not there weekly to kind of observe construction. That was challenging, and hence the technical advisor who was on site the duration of the construction. So there's two folks who did that. Sam Hagerman, who was with Hammer and Hand for a while, which is our local construction company specializing in high performance construction. And then later on, a fellow by the name of Thorsten Schlupp, who had his own contracting business in Alaska. He's really passionate about high performance design. I think he currently works for a National Renewable Energy Laboratory. But they essentially lived in Bhutan, and Thorsten lived on site in that construction site for years while it was under construction. And so they were sort of the intermediary, and they were the eyes on construction to make sure things were happening the way they needed to, that the insulation was installed in the way that it needed to be, that the air sealing was happening the way it needed to happen. And so it was really invaluable to have that presence and somebody there who understood how all that stuff needed to go together.
I'm sitting here as you were talking about, they don't have any specifications and they don't do contracts the same way. Just having done contracts and specifications and all of that for years, I can only imagine what the conversation with your attorneys and errors and omissions insurance look like to make sure you were all covered on a project like this halfway across the world, because it's completely different sets of laws,
Yeah,
judicial systems. Like I'm surprised you were covered for a project like this.
yeah. I don't know. We didn't really talk too much about it. We
Okay,
were just so excited to work on the project. I think the other thing that's interesting too about Baton is the permitting and the building codes there are really, I'd say, lax. Not lax. Lax is a sort of a pejorative word. Loose is maybe a better word. And so where there wasn't guidance in their building code, we sort of used best practices that we use in the United States. And so that was all pretty easy once I kind of figured out what the bounds and parameters were of their code. But there was never a permit approval process. So enforcement is,
wow.
I don't know, questionable at best. The hardest thing that we had to do was sort of navigate the traditional design approval. There was effectively like a monk, I think, who would review our design and give, yeah, uh, give suggestions. And when I say suggestions, that's sort of tied up in that whole like politeness thing I was talking about earlier, where they would say, "Well, why don't you think about enhancing the cornice on the building?" Because when we started the design process, we were toured in Bhutan on some sort of newer projects, like a hotel and a few other projects that had, I would say, um, like traditionally influenced designs. So they looked like Bhutanese projects, but they didn't have all of the kind of ornamentation on them, simplified, modernized. And that's kind of the aesthetic that we had discussed internally about we were pursuing and discussed with the architects there, and they seemed in support of it. And then it would go through this traditional design review, and it would be viewed by the princess, and we'd get filtered back in the most polite way, like, why don't you think about doing, you know, enhancing this or beefing this up or changing that? And because it was framed in such a polite, kind way, I'd be like, well, no, I don't really want to do that. I think it looks better this way. And then over time, we'd get the same feedback and then the same feedback and then the same feedback. And it gets slightly more forceful each time. And then it finally dawned on me like, oh, they want us to change this. This has to happen.
This is not a
So
suggestion.
no, it's not really a suggestion, even though it's framed that way. So it would be as if you were going through permitting, local jurisdiction, and they say, "Well, why don't you think about making your stairs wider?" It's not a suggestion. It has to happen. They're just framing it in like the kindest way possible.
I mean, it's nice not to have angry people arguing with each other all the time, but
Yeah.
I would imagine that made life a little challenging, at least while you were figuring out that, whoa, wait, that's not a suggestion. Before you thought it was just a suggestion.
Hmm. Hmm.
I would imagine that made it a little challenging when they came back with that suggestion again. It's like,
Yeah,
just
there's a value in just being direct.
yeah.
And yeah, it just took a little longer, but we got there.
So let's talk about the design vision. What was your design vision for this building? And you've talked about it a little bit. There's little pieces and parts, but when you sat down and started really sketching this out, what
Mhm.
what were you looking to create?
Um, well, the first directive that we were given is essentially a high performance building in Bhutan. And so the first sketches that we did were like, well, how can we make this a very compact building form? Because that is one of the first principles as you're sitting down and design a building that's really energy efficient is to reduce the amount of skin. The more skin you have, the more bumps and crenellations and that sort of thing in the building form. Those are just more opportunities for heat to enter or leave your building where you don't want them, where you don't want that to happen. And so we're sort of sketching out um, cube kind of shape, rectangle, like short rectangle sort of shape, NASs, and landed on this. I think it's like a 3 or maybe 4 by 7 bay. It's been a little while since I looked at the plans, rectangle form. And that worked well with the slope, and we kind of oriented it in a way that, reduced the amount of excavation. So, really kind of practical concerns at the very beginning. There was also the consideration of the campus that it's trying to fit into. And so the full campus is designed to emulate a zong, which is spelled Dzong, and
Thank you.
yeah, it's a traditional form in Bhutan, and the zong is sort of like a all-purpose fortress, administrative, religious structure or accumulation of structures, and every kind of major town center has one, and they're really beautiful places. Oftentimes have large kind of courtyards in the center, and so the Bhutanese architects were designing the overall campus to kind of take on that form. It's a ring of buildings with a central tower in the center. In this case, that was essentially complete in their design, and so we had to kind of go on to the side of that. So we're trying to be very respectful of that, and so place the library in a way that's not going to kind of undermine the aesthetic of what they're trying to accomplish, but also like work with the slopes. As I think I mentioned earlier, it's on a very mountainous site overlooking the Paro Valley. There were some really lovely views that we're trying to take advantage of. So there's the building is a 3-story structure, like I said, kind of an elongated rectangle, and unfortunately, because of the orientation of the hillside sort of slopes down towards the northeast. And so not ideal for solar orientation, but towards the northeast is a lovely view of the valley. So we situated the primary reading room of the space, which is a double height space on the second and third floors overlooking that valley. Um, so yeah, I think that those are sort of the core ideas. Within the building, we did sort of look to the Zong for inspiration in terms of like how the circulation through the building worked. This was something that we learned. Took an initial visit back in 2015 and saw a lot of Zongs. The host architects kind of showed us around and really talked a lot about how while they are administrative and religious centers, they're also fortresses, because back when that was a thing that they had to be concerned about, the whole town would kind of like come into the zong for protection if they needed it. And they're just like medieval castles. There's no like big open door in the front of it that you can run straight in. That's like a circuitous path through, so that's more defensible. And so we took that. Not that we're trying to make the library a defensible kind of brutalist, structure or anything, but when you come in the front door, it's all very transparent and you see where you want to go, which is this central stair that connects all the floors. You have to kind of move around in an indirect way, and that takes you through different spaces. There's to one side is like a display of textiles, which I can talk about at length. And to the right is sort of the control point of the library with the main desk and the library staff there. And then you kind of move around those two spaces into the central stair, which is a big 3-story connecting stair with a decorative wood treatment on one wall.
So let's talk about this site for a minute. Like you mentioned, this is a mountainous site, a rather remote location. What did you have to work with what did you have to work with on the site, and what challenges did you face to get the site ready for a building? Because I'm sure it wasn't just flat and ready to go.
No, not at all. I think the challenge, well, to what I had was a pretty good survey. Um, what was interesting though was we had a survey of the slopes, which seemed to be very accurate, but like I said, our design was going next to a project that was under construction at the time. Their finished floor heights seemed to keep changing every time I asked. So it's kind of like, well, where exactly are they? Um, that was all worked out. I have to give a lot of credit to Thorsten, the technical advisor I mentioned earlier, because he was out there sort of getting down into the nitty gritty about exactly where things were lining up. And so we corresponded a lot at that time about how the building should exactly be sited on the slopes. Because of the extreme slopes, essentially the building is kind of nestled into the hillside with the entry on the lower part of the slope. And I think one of the other challenges was large excavation and kind of backing the building into that. We also have a lot of radon issues there, and Thorsten was really instrumental in making sure that that was taken care of appropriately because I don't think it's typically addressed in the country. So,
I wouldn't have had radon on my bingo card. I don't know why, but I
yeah,
wouldn't. I did not anticipate that part of the answer.
neither did I.
Um, so, what would you say are the most unique features of this building? Like, what would knock my socks off when I get there?
Oh, I would say that I'm really proud of and really love some of the finishes that we were able to achieve. So I mentioned really early on the battered walls, and so the overall mass of the building has these 3-story tall walls that are, like I said, a meter thick at the base, and then they taper as they go up. But they were constructed. Um, and this gets into the technical stuff that you're not going to see and not knock your socks off, but it's buried in that wall is there's a layer of insulation inside of this stone wall. But the outer layers are natural stone and then coated over with a thick stucco. So the texture of that is really, I think, lovely as the light kind of rakes across it, creates really interesting shadows. And there's a lot of other natural stone that isn't coated with stucco. I think the one thing that I was impressed with the Bhutanese craftsmen was their ability to work stone and wood, like just really amazing craftsmanship, and like without even having to ask for it, they just do like fantastic, just fantastic work. So the stonework was amazing. So I think that the battered walls are really impressive. Um, th- uh, the woodwork, um, there's sort of a mass. There's the battered walls, and then that two-story reading room I mentioned earlier is elevated above the ground level, and it projects out away from the battered stone walls, and it has really incredible wood cladding on it, and then at the top is a really ornate wood cornice, which is very traditional form. And so those are things that I think are really the the eye-catching elements on the exterior. And then as you move into the interior, it's really about kind of like I mentioned the quote unquote modernization of Bhutanese aesthetic. That's where that really comes into play is in the interior because the traditional design um, rules didn't apply as much on the inside. So we had a freer hand to do things on the inside. And I had mentioned earlier that three-story connecting stair has a really incredible called a mosaic wall, and it's a series of actually many thousands of essentially 4x4 end cuts of wood, and each one has a different depth, and so they're arrayed on the wall in a way that is meant to emulate some of the textiles. I had mentioned an answer or two ago about a textile display. One of the things that the folks that we were working for were really passionate about was the beauty of Bhutanese textiles, and they have these incredible formal outfits. Men wear something called a go, which is like a big heavy robe, which I did have to wear every time I did meet one of the royals. That was a requirement. Um,
Did you get to
which,
keep it?
yeah, I still have it. I don't wear it day to day, but I still have it in a drawer somewhere. But the women wear a traditional dress called a kira, and it's essentially like a big rectangle of textile, and they wrap it around themselves and then wear a little jacket over the top of it. But that rectangle of textile is really ornate and gorgeous, and they have these amazing geometric patterns sewn into them. And most of the time, like the really high quality ones are done by hand, and it can take a craftsman like a year to weave one of these things. So they're quite beautiful, quite expensive. And one of the things that we wanted to do with the library is to provide a space where some of that work can be displayed. There is a textile museum in the capital city, which is some distance away. But they wanted to partner with that the Royal Textile Academy is what it's called. So there's a partnership formed between the law library and the Textile Academy to display some of that work. And really, it was about displaying the beauty of the work, but also displaying or recognizing crafts people who do the work. Oftentimes, it's women, and it's like we just wanted to make sure that they were highlighted. So there's a display on the ground floor with that, and so that also the connection to the textiles really influenced some of the design decisions. So there's the mosaic wall made out of wood, which is meant to kind of look like the geometric patterns of the textiles, but also the carpet in the reading room was designed to do a similar thing. It's made of carpet squares essentially, but selected the colors and created a pattern that is meant to kind of emulate that.
Let's get into a little bit more detail about the exterior of the building and your wall assemblies and the roof. Describe for me, you've talked a little bit about the battered walls, which, by the way, what is a battered wall? What do you
Oh,
mean
it's
by
just
that?
it tapers upwards. So it's really wide at the bottom and
Okay.
then narrows as it goes up. Yeah.
Okay. I just want to make sure I understand because I'm like, I don't think I've heard that or have heard that term before.
Yeah, I
So,
learned it in like Architecture 101, and then I didn't use it again for 20 years. So,
what? Tell me about your enclosure design. I mean, obviously, there was a real effort here to make a really tight building. Tell me about some of the materials you used and what you did to achieve that.
right. So when I mentioned that we were doing technical advising to the original Bhutanese architects for the overall campus, that was 2015 through 2017. Um, Most of that was just understanding the materials that they had to work with, how they wanted to construct the buildings, and trying to mate a layer of insulation and a technique for air sealing the building that would not undermine that aesthetic. And so there were certain components that were essentially mandatory to meet the design aesthetic, the traditional design aesthetic. One is the battered walls. The other is those wood projections, which are called rapsels. So if I say the word rapsel, it just means like a timber framed projection from a masonry structure. Um, the other is a flying roof. So their roofs are essentially disengaged from the building envelope, almost like an umbrella. You know, there's free air flowing under the roof, and oftentimes there isn't anything to keep birds from flying in there. It's just this big umbrella that's built over the building. Um, and yeah, so those were sort of the key design notes that we had to hit. And in order to maintain that battered wall appearance, and usually there's a stucco or stone covering on that. Effectively, what we tried to do was build the structure how they would like to do that, which is out of reinforced concrete frame with masonry infill. They stucco over that, and that actually turns out to be quite a good air barrier. There's some testing done on how effective that was, and we saw the results of this in the library. We tested just a shade above Pascal's levels of air tightness in the end. Um, so we kind of have a reinforced concrete frame filled with masonry to complete it, and then coat all of that with insulation, and then build that battered wall on the outside of it. So our wall assembly is concrete frame, 4 centimeters of mineral wool insulation, and then a varying amount of masonry on the outside. And on the overall campus, they used autoclaved aerated concrete for that, which it's essentially like a concrete foam, very lightweight concrete blocks, and you can cut that with woodworking tools because it's so soft. So they used that to for the interior partitions, and then that exterior masonry wall to kind of essentially add on to the layers of insulation, and then coated that with stucco. That was on the overall campus. That turned out to be very difficult to kind of shave off the face of those blocks to create that sloped exterior wall. So on the library, we actually used regular stone, and then coated over that with stucco. And the thermal mass of it kind of was almost equivalent to the insulation, because the thermal, they have, similar to the climate that we live in, there's usually pretty big diurnal swings in temperature day to night. So if it's hot in the day, it's cool at night. And in the winter, the temperature's sort of like even. And so that thermal mass sort of mitigated some of the changes in temperature. So that was sort of the fundamental idea behind the wall assembly, was inserting a layer of insulation in the midst of this, which they don't normally do. They are a very high seismic zone, so we had to figure out a way to tie that exterior masonry wall back to the structure. Otherwise, it would just disintegrate in any kind of seismic event. So there are, from the reinforced concrete frame, there are concrete tabs that kind of come out and tie into that masonry in a limited fashion, almost like little tabs of concrete that go into the exterior cladding. And then there's like a bond beam built into that exterior masonry to tie it together and tie it back to the concrete tabs, which bring it back to the structure. So that's the wall.
Okay, I need to understand this roof because it seems
Yeah.
to me that it would be pointless to do all that in the walls if you have a roof that's open
Mhm.
and letting air in.
Yeah.
So you must have done something. Tell me what you did there.
Yeah, so the roof structure is a concrete deck, and then we piled on mineral wool insulation on top of that. And then the walls kind of extend up beyond up to the top of that mineral wool insulation. So it kind of completes the thermal barrier. The concrete deck itself is essentially the air barrier in that case, although they did put a waterproofing membrane on the concrete deck. So if any water does happen to blow in sideways, it would be pretty difficult for this to happen. The winds would have to be extreme. But if water would be blowing onto the roof, there's a waterproofing membrane there. Um, so essentially, we've got a concrete deck, insulation piled on top of it. So those are our thermal and air barriers. And then, like I mentioned, there's a roof over the top of it, which is essentially like a rain umbrella, directing water away from it. So all of the layers that we're used to are there. It's just kind of different the way that they do it. I would say it's not unlike, like my house has a ventilated attic made out of, wood frame. The air can kind of move into it, and above it, the air barrier is presumably not in my house because house is old and leaky. But if I were to do this the right way, the ceiling would be airtight, and then the insulation's piled on top of it, and then above that is ventilation moving through the attic space. So it's not dissimilar from that, really.
I have to make sure that all these building science engineers I work with know about this episode so they can come listen to this. Your project description says that Bhutan is lauded as a carbon negative country because of its clean energy and extensive forests. What are the most notable sustainable measures you took with this project?
Apart from designing it in a way that is really energy efficient. So there were some studies, and I apologize, I don't remember exactly who the authors of these were at this point because it was years ago that I read them. But there were some studies that kind of assessed Bhutanese building stock and created like a baseline energy usage. And based on that, and our model performance, we are anticipating a savings of something like 75% over a typical building in Bhutan. Um, so I would say, fundamentally, the building is just energy efficient overall. It provides mechanical ventilation, which that's not typical in Bhutan either. So more healthy interior air quality is a goal there. I think a lot of the materials as well are a sustainable feature because they're locally grown timber, locally sourced stone, locally sourced cement and concrete. Because it's such a remote location and because Bhutan is such a small country, there's only 8 or 900,000 people in the entire country. Um, it's very limited in terms of what they have on hand, but we were able to source quite a lot of materials close by. Everything else was shipped in essentially from India, because they have everything. It's some of the products that are not typically used in Bhutan, some of the insulation, for example, came through India. But yeah, like all the timber is local, all the masonry and concrete materials are local.
So what does their timber look like compared to our timber, say here in Oregon?
Yeah, they use a lot of what they call blue pine, and I never investigated this exactly what species it is, but it's a very durable exterior material. For hundreds of years, they've used this on outside of buildings, and it does really well. And it might be partly their climate because it's really, I mean, when it gets down to it, rather dry. Because of the altitude, things dry out really well. Also, their winter is their dry season, and so when it's cold, it's quite dry, and in the summer, it's warmer and wetter, but because of the warmth, things can dry out pretty well. So even if we might not classify it as a decay-resistant wood, it works fine there. And so that's what the exterior and interior wood finish is.
What would you say was the most challenging thing to design on this project, and how did you make it work?
Probably that carpet.
Oh,
Um,
really?
yeah, Yeah, that was one that the princess felt really passionately about, and the folks in America, so from the Karuna Foundation that we were working with, felt passionately about. And and I give a lot of credit to Yuki, who I mentioned earlier, for working with me and everybody involved to try to solve that problem. We explored lots of different options from custom printed carpet, and this is probably 60 feet long and 20 feet wide or something in the reading room. We The princess was really had talked to Yuki about flying into into the airport and seeing the rice paddies, and like it really creates these beautiful um, kind of a tableau of these irregular patterns with a variety of colors, usually like different shades of green and stuff like that. It's really gorgeous. And she had mentioned that to Yuki, so Yuki was trying to like design something that looked like rice paddies from the air. Um, and then it turned out that this custom carpet wasn't going to work out because of cost and logistics and that sort of thing. And so she and I landed upon using carpet tiles, which are pretty readily available, and you can get a bunch of colors, and coming up with patterns. And I think we went through 40, 50 iterations of different patterns using different colors, and come up with 5 ideas, show them to the people we were working directly with. They're like, yeah, well, we like these two, and what about if we tried this and that? So eventually, we'd have 10 options. We send them off to Bhutan. The princess didn't like any of them. I mean, like, it was just like, it was a trial. But we finally got to something that everybody was pleased with.
Pretty handy though for the future. If you have to,
So,
do something interesting with a more regular material,
mhm.
good lessons
Yeah.
learned there. I love the lessons learned. You know, you
Yeah.
have to go take on some challenge and come up with something. And cost is always an issue on every project. You come up
Mhm.
with something that fits within the budget to make that happen. And I hear some interesting answers to that question. Um, let's talk a little bit about construction. I bet you there's all kinds of good stories. So my first question is about skilled labor for the project. I mean, we suffer challenges with that in very populated areas of the
Mhm.
United States, getting access to enough skilled labor in certain areas. Um, I imagine, particularly when you're introducing new technologies, that could potentially be an even bigger issue. So let's start there. How hard was it to get the people you needed on site to come build something that's a little different than what they're used to building?
Yeah. I think this problem is particularly acute in Bhutan. Culturally, it's sort of looked down upon to be in the trades. And we suffer from that a little bit here too. People there aspire to work for the government, to be, social service kind of folks. And so getting people to work with their hands is kind of a challenge to begin with. As a result, a lot of their manual labor and construction labor comes from migrant workers from India, who are there usually on, I think, 6-month visas. And then they have to leave. They can't stick around. As I mentioned, Bhutan is a very small country. They're very protective of their very unique culture. And so if they kind of open their doors to folks from India, a country of 1 point, I don't know, 3 billion people, they would get overrun immediately. And there wouldn't be a Bhutanese culture anymore. And so they're trying to protect that like prevent that from happening by allowing workers in, but then they have to go back. And so any skills they accrue oftentimes go back with them back to India, and they don't come back. And so there's constantly like this influx of untrained people. And so I give tons of credit to Thorsten, who is the technical advisor who, to get new people on site. He would have to work with them and get them to understand what it is that we're trying to do, why we're doing it, and how to do it. And so there's a lot of churn, I think, in the labor force. One thing that was kind of a mixed blessing. Well, not a mixed blessing. That's the wrong term. That kind of influenced. the outcome of this was the COVID pandemic, which occurred kind of right in the midst of construction. And so sometimes people would come on site and then couldn't leave because there was quarantine. Bhutan really locked down much more seriously than the United States, and you couldn't even travel out of your town. A lot of times, they would have these really severe lockdowns. So sometimes the workers were sort of stuck there. But also, if they were to leave, they were really hard to replace because you couldn't get new people in. So it was really added extra challenge and slowed down construction considerably.
Is Thorsten in a rubber room, or did he recover from this project?
I don't know that. Yeah, you'd have to ask him. But he moved back to Alaska, so
Alaska probably feels really modern and easy after that experience, living in a
potentially. But
shack in the Himalayas.
yeah, the climate there is brutal. He's often telling me about how it's 40 below, and he'd go for a run or something like that. He's very athletic, always running or climbing something, and he would do it regardless of the temperature outside. So
I lived in
it's
Alaska twice, so I am familiar. I would not live there again. Beautiful place to visit, especially if you get out of the city. Um,
yeah,
Not the most fun, in my personal opinion, not the most fun place in the world to live in. But I don't like cold either, so
yeah,
go figure.
yeah.
Did the remote location cause challenges in getting the materials you needed to the site? I mean, it sounds like you already had
Yeah.
some things you couldn't source locally.
Yeah,
Um,
certainly. Getting insulated glass units was challenging, partly because of the remoteness and also partly because of the altitude. As you may know, and the listeners may know that the airfield gap in insulated glass units is affected by altitude quite a lot. And so that was a little bit of a challenge that was worked through. And then insulation materials, very early on in the project. So, uh, this was while I was still just the technical advisor and not doing any design work. We had kind of like a little meet and greet with suppliers from India who purported to provide insulation products. And there was a lot of like duct wrap and stuff like that they said we could insulate the building with. And I was like, No, 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 that's not what we're looking for." And so getting getting the right products and getting them on site in a timely fashion was hard. I think again, the COVID pandemic was extremely challenging. Getting materials in and out is, like I said, anything imported came through by truck from India, and that was all shut down for months at a time sometimes. So, yeah, I would say it was a challenge.
um, Let me see. So I love to ask architects this question. What was personally your biggest lesson learned from this project that made you a better architect on the next project?
I think that my communication skills improved. Um, I mentioned earlier about kind of the challenges with the time zone differences and slight language barrier, but also cultural differences in the way that people communicate. And I think it just made me more thoughtful about how I talk with people or especially write emails. Um, uh, try to be as clear as possible. And I personally struggle with this concise as possible while still trying to make my point. So I would say that that is the biggest lesson learned and the biggest takeaway for me is better communication.
I would imagine in a place where they are so committed to that, polite deference to other people, that Americans would come across pretty brash. The
Yeah,
directness, I could see where you could almost cross the line into potentially offending somebody unintentionally. Like you wouldn't offend me if you said it to me that way, but
right.
to somebody there that could be received a lot differently.
Yeah, I think you'd have to ask people that know me, but I feel like I'm pretty polite generally, but I was very worried about that all the time. Like, am I gonna sound like a jerk here? But at the same time, like in this business, you just have to. And sometimes you just have to be a little direct, like, this is what I need, this is what I expect, this is what I want. And so striking that balance is pretty challenging.
I would struggle with that in a big way. Yeah, I'm just like, say what you need to say and keep moving.
Mhm.
And I'm never not nice to anybody, but I would probably get in trouble there. So before we get to our two closing questions, tell me what Holst is working on now that I get to call you back later and say, hey, come tell me about that one. What's
Yeah.
going on in your firm right now? And what do we have to look forward to?
I think the two things that come to mind that are going to be interesting are the East County Library, which is another library project, a flagship library for Multnomah County built out in Gresham, Oregon. That is all mass timber. It's going to be a really amazing structure. I think it's months away from being completed. That won't be me on this podcast. I didn't really work on it too much. There's another team of people involved there. Another one is that comes to mind is the Julia West House, which is affordable housing. Pulse does lots and lots of affordable housing. I would say that that's actually our predominant typology that we work in. It's affordable housing in downtown Portland, 12 stories of mass timber. Really going to be quite an amazing project for us, and hopefully make some real impact for in helping people, find housing that are having challenges right now. So I think those are the kind of two things that come to mind. For myself, I'm working on like a whole range of things from a shelter in Hillsboro, Oregon, just a suburb of Portland, affordable housing in Southeast Portland. Recently completed a renovation to Portland City Hall, working on an interior remodel of an office for another private foundation, and trying to do that as sustainably as possible. So whole range of things, really.
So you're bored.
Never bored, always too busy.
Oh, trust me, I get it.
Is this it?
So I always close each episode with two questions, the first being a broader industry question. And again, I decided to stay on theme today with this project. So I can only imagine that the experience of working on a project like this really changes how you look at architecture, the practice of architecture, maybe even life. Um, do you think international experience should be a bigger part of architecture education?
I have personally benefited from it. I think it broadens your perspective on the world. I mean, like I mentioned earlier, I've been in different places around the world, and just for recreational travel, and it kind of, I think, fills in things that you don't get, if you don't really leave your local area. So I think there's a lot of value in travel to see the world, and a lot of value in working outside of your normal, even just your regular jurisdiction. We've done work in Idaho and Washington and places like that, and just like understanding how things work elsewhere is really valuable, and that's amplified when it's a whole other culture. So I would say yes.
Well, I would agree with you. I mean, I have not. I've worked for a number of firms, and I've done projects um, all over the world at some level or another at some point in my career. I will say that I've probably learned even more from hosting this podcast and talking to. I did an interview quite some time ago now, probably at least a year, with an architect in Iraq. And that one was on a home because we covered the gamut of types of projects on this podcast, but it was a home that didn't look like any of the other homes. And which actually ended up being an issue for the people that live there, being a war torn country. They build for the next war something, boxes. Everybody lives in a box, and here's this stone curved home. um, but talking to architects from all over the world and all parts of the country, in the United States, it's just I can't even describe how much I've learned. I can't go to all these places. I wish, but I can't. But getting that input and the ideas it spurs that you might not have ever thought about before. Like an architect in New York that 3D printed this kind of triangular 3D shape to put on the walls for an interior finish in this like kind of speakeasy kind of whiskey bar. And it looks like leather. I thought it was leather in the pictures, and it's not, but it looks like it when you walk into the space. Just crazy stuff that wouldn't have crossed my mind.
Yeah, I think, in the architecture school, you're exposed to projects from all over the world and throughout history. And I don't think there's any reason to stop that learning. And a lot of, once you've kind of read all the architecture books, then the next thing to do is just get out in the world and see new stuff.
Yeah, see it and touch it. Final question. Everybody gets this question, so you don't get to escape. I truly hope that we all want to live a life that leaves some kind of contribution to make the world a better place. So, personal or professional, what do you hope your individual impact will be?
Oh
Easiest
gosh,
question of the day.
that is a huge
I
question.
know it is. And it's
Um,
okay if it's just one of many things you'd like to accomplish.
yeah. I would say that I really take pride in my work, and I want it to be good, and I want it to be durable, and I want it to improve the, people who intersect with it. I want it to, make a difference in their lives, whether that be like just this feels like a pleasant space, or, it has some social impact on their lives. Like I mentioned, we're working on a homeless shelter right now nearby. So I hope that's my legacy, is quality work that helps people.
Well, Cory, I am pretty sure you're doing that just based on listening to the answers that you gave
Thank
me
you.
today about this project, and that you can feel the level of passion and pride in certain areas of this building, and a lot of commit. It sounds like a lot of blood, sweat, tears, and love went into this building, and it shows. It is an incredibly beautiful project. Uh,
Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming and sharing it with me today and sharing it with my listeners. Please know that you don't need an invitation. If you have a project that comes up that you think would be interesting to talk about, I may not see it when you see it. Feel free to reach out, because would love to have Holst back in the house, whether it's you or someone else, to talk about the things you're working on.
Thanks. Yeah, we have a lot of talented folks, so I'll keep you in mind.
You're welcome back anytime. Thank you.
Thank you.